The summer heat shimmered over the Moroccan coastline in 859 when strange shapes appeared on the horizon. At first they looked like any distant sails, distorted by haze and distance. But as they grew closer, the watchmen in the towers realized these ships were unlike any that belonged in these waters. Long, narrow hulls cut through the Mediterranean like blades. Shields lined their sides in bright colors. Carved dragon heads rose from the prows like mythical beasts from northern sagas. The guards stared in disbelief, because everything they knew about the world told them this could not be happening. These were Northmen, Vikings, men from frozen fjords thousands of miles away. They raided cold coasts, river settlements, monasteries in Europe. They did not belong here, beneath a blazing African sun, in the heart of the Islamic Mediterranean, where Muslim fleets had ruled the seas for generations. Yet here they were, sailing with absolute intent. The city of Nekor, nestled between mountains and sea, had never feared the horizon. Its greatest dangers had always come from inland. Rival tribes, political rivals, caravan raiders. Its strength lay in trade and in its connection to the great Islamic world. Scholars recited Quranic verses in its mosques. Merchants exchanged goods and news beneath shaded courtyards. The ruling family traced its descent from the Prophet's own line, lending the city a spiritual prestige that protected it as much as its stone walls. The Mediterranean itself seemed a shield. Islamic fleets dominated its blue expanse. Christian navies stayed to the north. No one imagined that raiders from beyond that world would ever come here. But the Vikings had already crossed the unimaginable. Led by Hastian and Bjorn Ironside, 62 longships had slipped through the Straits of Gibraltar under cover of darkness, their passage timed to avoid Muslim patrols. They had tested defenses along Iberian coasts and struck the Balearic Islands, gathering intelligence and wealth while spreading confusion about where they would strike next. To them, the Mediterranean was not forbidden. It was untapped, rich, soft, filled with cities unprepared for the shock of their arrival. As Nekor slept the final night before the storm, the Viking fleet drifted toward its beach like predators gliding toward prey that still believed it was safe. Dawn came with the sound of wood grinding against sand and oars slapping water. One after another, the longships slid ashore. Warriors vaulted into the surf, forming shield walls and precise movements honed through countless raids. Sunlight flashed on axes and helmets. Their shouts echoed up the slopes toward the city. Nekor's coastal garrison rushed to meet them, but they were few. Perhaps 300 defenders faced 3,000 invaders. They had trained for cavalry charges and sieges, not for shield walls advancing like iron tides. Arrows rattled against Viking shields. The Northmen pushed uphill relentlessly, boots digging into hot earth, voices rising in war cries that sounded as alien as the invaders themselves. The defenders broke before noon. Some fled toward the city walls. Others fell where they stood. Those who retreated hoped the stone fortifications would save them. But the Vikings were not a rabble. They were an army. Units rotated positions. Archers covered advances. Once the outer defenses faltered, the city's fate became a matter of time rather than possibility. Gates splintered beneath axes built to break both shields and hopes. Panic crowds flooded the streets. Smoke began curling above rooftops. Gold, silks, spices, slaves, anything of value, vanished into Viking hands. The palace fell by sunset, its treasures seized, its halls echoing with foreign laughter. And when the longships finally left, heavy with plunder, they carried away more than riches. They carried fear. Word spread faster than any ship could sail. A city of Islam had been struck from the sea by pagans from beyond the known world. If Vikings could reach Nekor, they could reach anywhere. The Mediterranean, once thought secure, now felt exposed. Merchants whispered. Rulers strengthened coastal watch. But the damage was already done. A myth had been shattered. The Northmen were no longer confined to Atlantic storms and northern rivers. They had crossed boundaries of geography and imagination in one stroke of daring seamanship. For the Vikings, the raid on Nekor was both triumph and experiment. The Mediterranean offered riches beyond the raided-out coasts of the north, and the shock value of their presence multiplied that wealth. Hastion and Bjorn Ironside had proven a point not only to their men, but to the world itself. There was nowhere too far, no sea too foreign, no enemy too confident to escape their reach. Yet the story did not end with gold and captives. The raid marked the beginning of a psychological shift in Mediterranean warfare. Cities that had once trusted the horizon now watched it with dread. Fleets were strengthened, defenses reshaped. Chronicles written decades later still remember the year when dragon-prowed ships appeared beneath African sunlight. And in Nekor itself, life resumed, but never as before. Rebuilt walls bore the memory of fire. Families recited the names of the lost. In mosques, preachers spoke of faith tested by unexpected trials. The emirate endured, but the illusion of safety granted by distance was gone forever. To the Vikings, the Mediterranean adventure became legend, sung in long winter halls, retold beside crackling hearths as proof that courage and cunning could bend the map of the world. To the people of Nekor, it lived on as a scar carved into memory, a reminder that even the most certain truths, like who ruled the sea, could change overnight. In the end, the raid on Nekor was not just a story of conquest. It was a moment where two worlds touched violently for the first time. The northern raiders driven by hunger and ambition, and the prosperous Islamic south certain of its control over the sea. For a brief, blazing chapter in 859, their histories collided, and neither side ever saw the Mediterranean the same way again. News of Marcus's actions spread quietly at first, whispered between merchants, gossiped over firelight, carried encoded messages along the trade roads. Some called him reckless, others called him naive, but there were also those who believed he was the last honest commander left in a world where loyalty had become nothing more than a bargaining chip. His soldiers, watching every step he took, began to sense the tremors beneath the surface. They sharpened swords in silence, unsure whether they were preparing for war or for betrayal. Marcus was summoned back to the capital. The city rose out of the plains like a memory of greatness. Marble columns stained with age, statues cracked by neglect, banners hanging limp in the still air. Yet beneath the fading glory, the streets were crowded, restless, alive with rumor. People stared as Marcus passed through, some bowing with respect, others watching with suspicion, as if he carried the future on his shoulders. Inside the Senate Hall, voices clashed like blades. Senators accused one another. Accusations spiraled into panic. Marcus stood at the center, calm but burning inside. He spoke clearly, refusing to blame the innocent, refusing to let the leaders escape responsibility for a war they had fueled with arrogance and fear. His words echoed off stone walls that had heard centuries of promises and lies. But there are always ears listening in the shadows. That night, as lamplight flickered across the corridors of power, plans began to take shape. Not shouted, not argued, just agreed upon, quietly, efficiently. The kind of decision that end a man's life not for what he has done, but for the threat of what he might do tomorrow. Marcus sensed it in the air, that faint shift, the way servants avoided his eyes, the way soldiers saluted a fraction too stiffly. He slept lightly, armor close by, sword within reach. And yet, even as danger circled, he refused to leave. This was his city, his people, his Rome. If fate had chosen him for this path, he would walk it with open eyes, even if those same eyes would soon close forever. The final march did not begin with drums or trumpets. It began with silence. Marcus led his legion toward the frontier, tasked with ending the rising unrest before it could ignite into full rebellion. The order was official. The handwriting on the scroll bore the emperor's seal. But Marcus knew the truth. The real weapons were not the swords at his back, but the signatures inked in secret rooms. Still, he rode at the head of his men. The road stretched endlessly under a pale sky, dust swirling in tired spirals. Villages appeared like islands of smoke and roofs. Children ran beside the columns, waving, Old men watched with hollow eyes, remembering wars they never wanted. The soldiers, hardened veterans and nervous recruits, followed Marcus not because of duty alone, but because he had never lied to them. And that kind of loyalty cannot be ordered. It must be earned. One evening, as campfires flickered across the valley like fallen stars, Marcus gathered his officers. Maps lay spread on the table, held down by daggers. But the conversation slowly drifted away from strategy and towards something heavier: destiny, sacrifice, the price of honor. It was then Marcus spoke the words that would echo long after he was gone. "If they kill me," he said quietly, "it will not be on the battlefield. It will be by those who fear truth more than the enemy." No one spoke. The wind seemed to pause. He was not afraid for himself. Death, he had learned, was never the true opponent. The real enemy was corruption, cowardice, the slow erosion of the soul. And Marcus would rather die whole than live fractured. The men returned to their tents in silence. Some prayed, some sharpened their blades, and somewhere, cloaked riders carried messages through the night, sealing his fate with every hoofbeat. The trap was perfect because it was simple. At dawn, a message arrived, an urgent request from Marcus to parley with envoys said to represent the rebels. A chance for peace, they claimed. A chance to end bloodshed before it began. Marcus hesitated only long enough to weigh the lives that might be spared. Then he agreed. He went with a small escort, as custom demanded. Honor, after all, required trust, even when trust had become a dangerous luxury. The meeting place was a ruined watchtower overlooking a river. Mist curled around the stones, softening the world into a ghostly dream. Birds cried somewhere beyond sight. Marcus dismounted, scanning the shadows, every instinct alive. His hand rested lightly on his sword, not out of fear but readiness. The first arrow struck before he saw the archer. It pierced the throat of the soldier beside him. Another arrow, then another. Then the cloak of silence tore apart into chaos. Marcus drew his sword, voice ringing like iron, rallying his men into a tight shield wall. They fought bravely, outnumbered, ambushed, doomed. And yet Marcus did not fall. He moved like a storm, every strike precise, every breath steady. Blood soaked the stones, the mist, the earth itself. But ambushes are not won by courage. They are won by calculation. When a final blow came, a blade from behind, driven by betrayal, Marcus staggered but did not cry out. He turned, meeting the eyes of the man who struck him. A familiar face, a fellow Roman. For a heartbeat, time stopped. Then he fell. The river carried the echo of that moment far downstream, into villages, into cities, into history. The official report would speak of rebels, of tragedy, of unfortunate necessity. But the people whispered the truth. Marcus had predicted his own murder, and Rome had killed the last man still fighting for. The news of Marcus's death did not arrive with ceremony. It did not march proudly through the gates with banners or trumpets. It slipped into the city like a shadow at dusk, whispered from lips that trembled, repeated by tongues unsure whether to mourn or remain silent out of fear. At first, there was confusion. Some said he had fallen in glorious battle. Others insisted he had been betrayed. A few, the most careful, said nothing at all, because silence had become the safest language in Rome. In the Senate, the announcement was read aloud in a voice purposely drained of emotion. General Marcus Aurelius Varro was slain by rebel forces during a diplomatic mission. The empire honors his sacrifice. The senators bowed their heads, but their eyes did not grieve. Some of them had expected this outcome. A few had arranged it. Others simply accepted it as the price of stability, the quiet removal of a man who had reminded them too much of what they themselves had once sworn to be. Outside those polished halls, however, the reaction was very different. Soldiers from Marcus's legion, men who had followed him through storms, hunger, and endless campaigns, received the news as though lightning had split the world open. Hardened veterans wept openly. Young recruits stared into nothing, tried to understand how a man who seemed stronger than fate itself could simply be gone. Campfires burned lower that night. Songs went unsung. Laughter died before it reached the lips. But grief soon turned to anger. Rumors poured through the ranks like oil over fire. This was no rebel strike. This was execution by decree. The men knew it. They felt it in the marrow of their bones. There had been no honor guard to return his body. No official mourning rites. Only a cold, convenient explanation offered to men who were expected to obey rather than question. In the markets, women spoke softly as they bought bread, leaning closer so their words could not travel far. He was the last good one, they said. The last who remembered that Rome belonged to its people. Old veterans sitting on cracked stone steps lifted their eyes to the sky and wondered how long an empire could survive after devouring its own heart. Yet the authorities warned against dangerous speculation. Statues of emperors were polished. Coins were minted. Speeches were made about unity and stability. And beneath it all, Marcus's name became something powerful, a quiet symbol passed from mouth to mouth, from soldier to farmer, from scholar to child. They could kill the man, but they could not kill the truth he spoke. And somewhere beyond the city's edge, the river still whispered his final moment to anyone willing to listen. The men who had arranged Marcus's death slept poorly. Power can quiet fear for a while, but it cannot silence conscience forever. At night, the senators and courtiers who signed the orders found themselves waking in cold sweats, haunted by dreams they never spoke of. In those dreams, Marcus did not accuse them. He simply watched, calm, steady, unbroken, and somehow that silent gaze was far worse than any curse. Yet the empire did not collapse. Life went on. The markets opened. Children chased each other through courtyards. Soldiers trained beneath the watchful eye of their commanders. The world continued to turn, proving, as always does, that even the greatest lies are grains of sand within the endless hourglass of history. Still, something had changed. Whispers began to weave themselves into story. Stories hardened into legend. They spoke of the general who refused bribes, who ate the same rations as his men, who walked the muddy roads instead of riding past the people he served. They spoke of his final warning, that corruption, not the enemy, would be Rome's downfall. And in taverns lit by dim lamps, men leaned close and repeated the line that struck deepest of all. He predicted his own murder. In time, that sentence became a quiet challenge. To rulers, to soldiers, to history itself. Meanwhile, in distant provinces, unrest simmered. Loyal commanders asked uncomfortable questions. Taxes increased to feed the growing hunger for power in the capital. And the more the empire tried to control the story, the stronger it became. Children repeated Marcus's name as though invoking a forgotten guardian. Widows placed flowers at unnamed graves. Old men tapped their walking sticks against the earth and muttered, "If Marcus were alive, things would be different." The irony was bitter. Marcus had never sought glory. He had only wanted Rome to remember its duty to its people. But in death, he became exactly what he had tried to avoid, a myth. And myths cannot be ordered. They cannot be silenced. They live in the spaces where truth survives after those in power have rewritten the records. His killers began to realize this too late. They had removed a man, but they had created a symbol. And symbols, once awakened, belong to the world, not to those who fear them.